Ugh. I think you're on mute.
I am indeed. And you know what? Something weird happened. I'm actually on my phone, which doesn't really work for me. Just trying to figure out somehow your invite saved to my phone and not to my normal calendar and didn't sync. So I had massive problems. Well, I can try and do this from my phone, I suppose. Nice to meet you. Hi.
Nice to meet you as well. Do you want to try again, or should we try another platform, or what do you?
No, do you have a link or something that you could email me quickly? Are you using sort of a normal university Zoom invite or?
Yeah,
Would you mind resending it to me so I can just try and put it on, do it via my computer because my phone is not great.
yeah, I understand. Yeah, let me try sending this to you.
Thank you.
So I'll reply to your last email to me.
Perfect.
And
Perfect.
do you wanna stay on and see if you can make a separate connection here, or
Yeah, let's not to lose too much time. I know that it's quite late on your side. I'm just
yes,
gonna see if I can work this. Maybe you can so long tell me a bit more background about what you plan to do. And I assume you had your meeting with my UCT colleague already on Wednesday morning.
I did. So okay, I just sent you the link,
Perfect.
and I talked to Martha Evans, she studies literary journalism. It's a little different than
Right.
the discipline.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and I'm trying to figure out, so people have been gracious, and now that, of course, the time is tight. I ran into some personal issues, which was just that uh, I wanted to use early August for this, but I have an elderly father, and he fell, and then I kind of had to make an emergency trip to care for him, and I got COVID on the way. So now
Oh,
here
no.
we are with, days left, and so people were really gracious in reply, but now that's left me with things a little bit up in the air and some difficult choices to make. Okay, so you're getting through. So let's see if this
Yeah.
works.
So I'm gonna log out of the phone. Thank you.
The feedback doesn't.
Right. Okay.
Ah, here we
Much
are.
better.
The resolution was actually better on your iPhone, I think, almost.
Really?
Well, maybe.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah. So I have to look. It was interesting. So closer to the parks, I think, and to the stuff. Um, I reached Wits University of Wits University, Witterswand. Is that how you pronounce it? Um,
Advertisement. Yeah. Yeah.
uh, and University of Limpopo, where I don't know if how well you know Anthony Minar, but he was the one who uh, described your work and suggested I reach out to you. Do you know him much?
We have not met in person, but I've published. No, no, actually, I didn't. So it's quite surprising. No, we've been in touch. I mean, the criminology community is quite small in South Africa. So I know of his work, but it's very different from the kind of criminology that I do. So essentially, Cape Town, University of Cape Town is known sort of as mostly progressive critical criminology. And a lot of the criminology done across South Africa is still sort of quite, let's call it sort of crime control focused.
Yeah,
So we have different approaches, but having said that, Anthony has done some very interesting work. So I've read him, but I've not met him. I also don't know how much field work he does. He's an older gentleman. I think he's in his 60s or something, 70s.
and
So I don't know.
he's not like really full-time faculty there. I get the feeling he's not like on campus over there. And he also, it was a little confusing what he was saying. I tried to do a Zoom meeting with him to get because it's hard a lot of times to get a feel for somebody over emails. And
Yeah,
my
yeah.
sense was that he didn't seem to want to do. He was okay with it, kind of it was interesting because he was okay with kind of inviting me to collaborate with the department or offering me support, which I thought was very gracious. But then he kind of wouldn't like, talk on the phone or on Zoom with me. But I got the sense he doesn't really do wildlife stuff. He maybe has done a little bit about that involving the dark web, but that wildlife isn't necessarily his thing. His email was a little bit confusing on that score, so it was hard to tell.
Right. I've seen a couple of draft articles that he's written with another South African criminologist, and they were on wildlife trafficking.
Yeah.
Elephant poaching and
Right.
sort of things. Yeah, I don't know what the situation is at the University of Limpopo. You know, I've met a few younger criminologists there. It's a very positivist approach, you know.
Well,
Um,
so
yeah,
my dilemma is, on the other hand, I reached out to Wits University and because he had given me a list of journalism programs, because I'd said, you know, kind of like what I said
yeah,
to you, maybe I should be reaching out to journalists because that's what I know and teach. And
yeah, yeah,
and so they all responded very positively, although I think it where it got left, you know, the time is running really short, and I the last one I got was, I think, on Monday, where this the chief of the department said, well, all of my colleagues are really interested in you, and I'm looking into official approval, that kind of thing. And then
yeah,
so I thought I would hear something in another day or two. And I haven't. It's kind of gone dark, but I'm wondering, you know, you guys in a way would be ideal, because I've already sort of met you and Martha, and you both seem like you know, reached out to me right away. But you're 17 or 18 hours from the parks, and then whereas over there, they one is a journalism program, and I'd have to figure out, you know, so is that going to be a teaching? See, I guess Fulbright does teaching, research, or combination teaching and research.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah.
I've got this. So the way things are now, I've got the journalism people who seem like very friendly over there, nearer to Limpopo, or to the province in Timbavati. What is it? I can't pronounce it. It's Mumpamala.
Mpumalanga.
Yeah,
Just drop the M, so then it becomes a bit easier. Mpumalanga. You'll
Mpumalanga.
get used to it once you get here. So
Yeah, I'm
no,
barely
actually,
getting.
yeah,
Yeah, I was gonna
you
say.
know, yeah,
Go ahead.
you go.
I was gonna say, I'm barely getting the Hawaiian these days, you know. So no. Go ahead. That wasn't worth interrupting you twice.
No, I mean, I was just going to suggest, I mean, now that talking to you and listening to you, I'm just wondering, there's something called the South African Wildlife College that is right in the Kruger landscape. It's a private sort of training facility. They have some tertiary, and yeah, it's sort of courses. Not necessarily journalism, but you know, they always have interesting sort of partnerships that they're seeking. And maybe if you could you know, do something on research related stuff with them. I mean, the nice thing of being at the South African Wildlife College, that is, for example, not very far away from Timbavati. So if you really want to sort of go and spend time in the Hoedspruit area, Acornhoek and Timbavati, the South African Wildlife College would be ideal. But you know, also having said that, you know, I spent a lot of time up in the Kruger landscape. It's a 2-hour flight from Cape Town, so it's not very far. And you know, there are lots of different places where you can stay quite cheaply. So it's a matter of, you know, I think it would be nice to have a close connection to somebody in the landscape, in the Kruger landscape. Sorry, I'm using sort of the South African terminology here. So South African Wildlife College might be interesting. There's another university with which I have had very little interaction. It's called the University of Mpumalanga. They're also very close to Kruger. So if it's an issue of proximity and being close to, you know, your research sites, then maybe the South African Wildlife College or something like the University of Mpumalanga would be great. Witwatersrand, yeah, that's about 4.5, 5 hours. You know, I mean, everything is doable. South Africa is a very modern country, you know, everything is connected. So it depends. I mean, in terms of Fulbright, you might want to be closely aligned with an institution like UCT or Witwatersrand. But I suppose there would also be great benefits to the South African Wildlife College if you were to provide some training and stuff. It's just, you know, it's not quite the, you know, the high university level that maybe, you know, Fulbright would be accustomed to. So it's sort of, you know, it's more of a training college, technical college, you know.
Well, I guess the main thing is I'm pretty much out of time. I mean, I have until September 30th to get the letter of invitation from whoever, but I only have until September 15th, which is, you know, I have to write my proposal this weekend. And so I have until next Thursday, basically, and if that, given the time difference here with the East Coast to Hawaii, to get the priority out. And so what I have is I think it can be nominal. In other words, if I agree with you all at UCT that it's an agreement, like if we were to do a research one, I wouldn't necessarily need to be there, but I'd need to help draft a letter of invitation with you all and explain. I mean, basically what I have to do is I have to explain in the proposal what benefits the project will be for the host, meaning host country, but also the institution, you know, and then my discipline and then my on my end.
Nice.
So
well, let's talk about that. I mean, maybe give me some idea as to what Martha said. So I don't know Martha, but the Media and Film Studies at UCT, it's an excellent department. So you wouldn't go wrong with that. So did she have any ideas on how to set up a sort of like a beneficial relationship?
Well, she, you know, we had a lot of intellectual interests in common, and she was just basically like, you can come here and teach. You know, I think it's interesting because our school year begins in the fall and ends in the spring, and for you guys it's vice versa. I think with her, she had in one semester an environmental reporting class and some some skills classes that I've taught many times here, but also a literary journalism class. You know, in addition to both teaching journalism, we both are people who study the history of journalism. She and I are unique.
Okay, right.
So not by any means do all scholars who do journalism do that, but we're more into literary journalism, and I do journalism history. And so she was saying that would be great. The only problem is if I'm teaching a couple times a week and I'm 17, 18 hours from the parks, the teaching arrangement at UCT didn't make as much sense. But you don't, from what the Fulbright language is, I don't need to be teaching a class. I can do some lectures, and that, you know, that
I mean, I would recommend that you maybe teach a few seminars or something. And you know, UCT still has sort of a hybrid situation because of COVID. I mean, we don't have national health regulations anymore, but certainly in the law faculty where I'm based, there's still what we call blended teaching. So some lecturers choose to do online. So there probably be the different possibilities. I mean, you know, I suppose in terms of like the work that we do in the Global Risk Governance Program, we could well talk about a research association, but we would just have to see, you know, what is the mutual benefit? Would we be working on something together? Would you maybe provide one or two seminars on something you've done or something to that, you know, on that level?
You mean
so that's all a possibility, and I would have to run that past my team, of course, but you know, I think there are definitely commonalities, but I mean, it's up to you. I mean, Cape Town is a distance from Kruger National Park. And let me ask you, so your environmental defenders that you've focusing on, are they all in the northeast of the country, or have you? I mean, is it a South African focus on environmental defenders, or is it just, you know, Anton was obviously assassinated quite recently. I was actually 6 kilometers away from where he was assassinated when this happened. But the environmental defenders across South Africa involved in mining, fighting mining houses, oil and gas explorations, all sorts of things. So it depends on how far you cast the net. Is your focus on wildlife defenders, or are you going a bit broader?
My focus, well, first of all, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was because it's very hard for me to understand any of this from so far away. And I wasn't able to get very deep even into the research in terms of the literature on it, because of the time and everything. So they want, I mean, I think what Fulbright wants is a proposal, right? So you want to have, you need to have some idea. But I think that given that it's a proposal, and a proposal of this nature, and it being journalism, it's okay that that I'll find the story when I get there. And one of the things that Martha emphasizes was, in South Africa, I mean, I didn't want to start doing all this reporting for this sabbatical that's a year away, just for this proposal. Also, with everything that's happened over the last few weeks, it wasn't really practical. She was saying it's really hard to reach a lot of these people that work in the parks unless you're in situ. People's phone numbers change, their addresses change, their names can be hard to find the spelling of. She's like, you kind of want to be on the ground to do some of the reporting. But I think what also you're asking is, what kind of a story am I after, and why am I after it, right? Is that part of what you're getting at?
Just to give me a bit better of an idea what you want to do. I mean, I obviously read the introductory emails, and I got a sense, your interest was sort of stoked when with the recent assassination of the Timbabati ranger. I mean, the jury's still out, by the way. It's not quite clear if he was assassinated by rhino poachers, or maybe it was a retaliatory sort of action because, he is a ranger, or something he might have done in the past. They're interesting community dynamics. So there are lots of questions around it. But so maybe let's start about. So you've got sort of a general interest in environmental defenders. Is that right?
I mean, I think a lot of the spark of inspiration came from watching years ago, that when it came out, like that Netflix documentary Virunga.
Okay.
Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
And I think what struck me is, that it was extraordinary that, I mean, I guess I should say, I don't need to focus on people who have been murdered and who are dead. I can focus on people who are alive. I'm trying to find the best approach, but I think what I'm interested in is, well, on one level, what drives these people to put themselves at such risk? And also, what kind of a bond is there potentially with the animals? And then one of the things that Martha raised that's really important, I think, in all of this, and I need your help a little bit in terms of explaining this in the right way, if I'm going to put it in the Fulbright proposal, was she's saying, there are big schisms in terms of that fall on economic and also on racial and cultural lines about the feelings and what motivates this. She was sort of saying that a lot of the wealthier white people in Southern Africa are maybe motivated by an idealistic conservationist goal that I'm sort of suggesting, of them defending the animals, but that a lot of people are working as rangers for economic reasons, and that there's a very different attitude towards the animals themselves and what they're worth among people who are African or from African culture, or from poorer communities. You know, a lot of people obviously are poaching for the money, and some of it's just to survive, you know, or a lot of it is just to survive. So the idea that, you know, that there's that it's the bond that's necessarily motivating people to take the risks, the bonds that they have with the animals, is not necessarily the case in every situation. Like, I wonder if the rangers, for example, I don't know about in South Africa, but certainly like in the Congo, you know, where they're dying a lot, if that's if they're putting themselves regularly at such risk because of their connection to the animals purely as a you know, an environmental thing, or if a lot of it is economic, and they're just limited choice, you know, options if you live somewhere like that, and this is a job opportunity. And part of her point was in terms of what benefit I could bring to the country, and maybe to the see, I think your answer is going to be different because you've studied this as a scholar, and you're not in kind of a literary journalism program looking from afar. You know, you have a much more granular knowledge of this. But, you know, I thought her point, you know, is a good one, that one benefit it could be to the country, and also in a way to the institution, is I'm an outsider. This is a conversation that needs to happen nationally in South Africa, and maybe within university communities, about value systems and conservation and attitudes towards the, you know, the wildlife in South Africa. And that as an outsider, I have an opportunity to see things differently and to open up a conversation that maybe needs to happen. She threw that out there, but I won't.
Yeah.
What?
Can I ask you to quickly allow me to share my screen with you? I just want to show you something from a presentation that I delivered yesterday at in a game reserve at a conservation congress.
I think I have to make you a co-host.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, hold on. Let me make you a co-host.
Yeah, because right now I can't share. I just want to show you something because it speaks to what Martha O'Brien's. Okay, let me see. Share screen. Here we go. Right. Can you see these quotations?
The rhino goes extinct tomorrow.
I think it kind of really speaks. This is all research that I've done. You know, I've worked across Southern Africa, but this is sort of like interview data, focus group data. And I think it speaks to the schisms that Martha and you also just mentioned. So the conservation enterprise, it's definitely the racial aspects to it. You know, people are not going to think about saving animals or biodiversity when they cannot put bread on the table. And the story about rangers or wildlife defenders sometimes just doing a job because that's what is available, that definitely holds true. So there are very interesting aspects to it. And I like what Martha said to you. So, you know, at this conservation congress that I was at for the last few days, an American colleague was speaking there as well. And afterwards, I was approached by a South African conservationist. She said to me, but why is this person talking to us about, you know, conservation scenarios? And I said, you know, sometimes you really need to step outside. You need outside perspectives, because when you're so involved in everything, you sometimes lack the perspective and sort of a bit of distance from the research topic. So I think there's definitely something about sort of having an outside lens on what is going on the ground. Yeah, I mean,
and I should say, you know, in the United States, like I'm a what they call a Yankee. You know, I grew up in Boston, and I was hired in South Louisiana for a paper down there specifically because I was an outsider. You know, I spent over a year down there, and then I ended up moving down there and living for years in Louisiana. But you know, and they were kind of joking because the first story I covered for the newspaper, this was back in 2000, but the first story I covered was about the Ku Klux Klan, and they kind of laughed.
Oh,
They said, "Give the Yankee the Klan story," when I first got to the paper. But actually, the first story I showed up for, because the night before, or you know, I was thinking about this as Martha and I were talking, because one of the questions is, what's your personal impetus for this? And it was, you know, as I thought about it, honestly, a lot of it has to do with, I don't know if you can see, but my, you know, my cats.
yeah, I can see them. I
You
see
know,
the one in the back corner.
right, yeah, and they, I mean, it's an odd thing to say, but you know, different animals are ambassadors in really powerful ways for wildlife, and and then as I thought about it a little bit deeper, the first time I had an animal of my own, you know, I think there's a real difference between when you're a child and if your parents have a pet or something. And when you become an adult, if you, like, when I was in my 20s, it never occurred to me to have an animal. It'd been many years since we'd had one in the family. And when I went to college and got out of college, I wasn't thinking of having an animal. And then when I became a reporter, I was having to do once a week in this community, it was in New Mexico, features about local figures. And it occurred to me, oh, I'll do one about the dog catcher, not thinking about what I was getting myself into. And it was, you know, the animal control officer. And I had this cartoon image in my head with the guy with the hoop, you know, chasing after dogs. And instead I did a story about animal control, and it was like, I found it was traumatizing for me. I mean, I didn't realize I was so sensitive about animals. And I mean, it was like I kind of almost had PTSD. And I woke up the next morning, and as I opened the door, there was this not quite adult cat that flopped over and showed me his belly. And he was outside and stray. And so I immediately brought him in, and that was my first animal that I had. And then I did a year in New Mexico at this paper. This is going back, but when they asked, what's your personal impetus for this? You know, as I was talking to Martha, these memories started coming back. That then when I moved to Louisiana, before they gave me the Klan rally story, I had arrived and I met the reporter I was replacing, and he was out to do a story about cockfighting. And again, I had this, you know, I don't want to, I guess, repeat the naivete, but I had this idea of like, oh, this will be this exotic journey into Southern culture, and I'll see this, you know, thing. And it was the most horrific, you know, spectacle I'd ever seen. I mean, and I'd been covering killings for like a year as a cops reporter of people and gang killings, but I'd never seen anything this horrible. And
Right.
and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think that was where I realized with first having animals of my own that animals were really important to me, and that their inner lives or their emotional lives I found like richer than I had ever imagined before I got close to any of my own. And then I became an environmental reporter for years in Louisiana and Florida, but it was more about the wilderness. And you know, Louisiana and Florida are battlegrounds. It's sort of, I suppose, in a way, Africa is a battleground over the environment. And it's funny because in Hawaii, it's not, you don't quite see the battle the way that you do in
Right.
Louisiana, where they're drilling, or Florida, which is quite a conservative area, and there's a lot of really aggressive, you know, pollution and problems, right? And so, but I was reporting on the wilderness, and then I got away from that. I spent 10 years doing media history and really working as a historian. But the experiences of doing environmental reporting, waking up to the sixth extinction as a scientific reality, and to climate change, 20 years ago, to seeing that as an evolving thing, to oil and gas drilling, which I covered in Louisiana, all kind of gave me a very strong environmental orientation. And then I think when I saw, there's also the storyteller side of me. And so I think when I saw Virunga, I thought I think what struck me more now when I've returned to it and have been learning about it, what happened was so just a little bit about how I ended up reaching out to you guys for this story, how it narrowed to that, because if you had talked to me about this in late July, all I would have been able to tell you is, well, I'm interested in wildlife defenders, putting their lives on the line. And I kind of knew something about the Congo with it, and I knew poaching was an issue vaguely. But when I reached out to Global Witness, they gave me a map where they showed where wildlife defenders have been killed all across the world since 2010. And you can drag your cursor and get the names of these people. And frankly, it wasn't necessarily Anton Zimbar or Leroy Brewer that drew me. It was, first of all, I looked at the Amazon, which already the national press here is really kind of all over. The New York Times and the Washington Post is doing front page stories about it. They don't need me doing one. And, everything from Mexico to Latin America, there's dots where people have been killed all over that, but it's the cartels, it's indigenous rights battles. I just felt like if I go there, I'm not going to be doing a story about animals and people. And the same thing with the Philippines. It seemed like I don't even know what animals are in the Philippines, but it didn't, what really drew me to Africa was, I think, being an American, and I'll explain this, but it's, I think, again, for an African, especially, someone who's like a poorer African, this is a bit of a leap. But for an American, the animals of Africa are the only connection or association we have is from childhood, right? Because we go to zoos as children and we go to Disney movies and they're animated characters. But I wouldn't understate that as a connection. It's so much of like giraffes and lions and gorillas and all that is kind of very close, I think, to the hearts of people who grew up that way, because it's, their childhood. And I guess why the idea of going to Africa to do the story about the conflicts going on with this and the threats that they're under is that it's just, the idea that these animals are disappearing from our world is, these are the animals of our child. The idea of a world without elephants or a world without lions or whatever is a scary thing. And I think, like, as a historian, I mean, my first book, the one I've published, is about the Holocaust, and it was about extermination. And I think as a historian, I have the perspective of the sixth extinction. It's like we're living through this really unique moment where we're seeing the disappearance of all of these creatures, maybe within our lifetime, according to a lot of the science. And so part of it was being able to tell that story, and the idea that, then I thought about, I don't know what you would call them, like environmental anthems, or I don't know what the word would be, but books like Silent Spring, the classic environmental books, and everything from like Silent Spring to like the Monkey Wrench Gang. One thing that really strikes me about a lot of them is, and I sort of said this in the email briefly, right, was that they don't speak with the voice of like what we're living through now, with an awareness of environmentalism. Like there's a magnitude of crisis and a depth of tragedy that they didn't have writing about this stuff in the 70s or the 50s or whatever. And then on the flip side, I felt like, there's a tradition, and this is the kind of writing I've done for years, of very strong narrative writing, and especially when I'm doing journalism, but also when I do narrative history. I don't do sort of analytical history, and it's a narrative tradition that goes back to Herman Melville and Moby Dick, through Jack London and Stephen Crane, up through to John Krakauer, of An Adventure in the Wilderness, that I thought, there's something really here. And then when I was looking at that map, I thought, well, Africa is really where I would get the story. I mean, from a messaging point of view, or from the idea of it being a book that speaks with a voice of environmentalism, it seemed like that would really have the emotional depth, and really the highest stakes, as opposed to going to the Philippines to do this story, or to Mexico, and then, as far as I guess, when I was looking at the map, and I was looking at the people killed in the Congo, and I don't know, I haven't read books about what's going on there, and I don't know who's funding the Virunga National Park, or who's paying the paychecks of these rangers, but I'm looking at the number of deaths per year, the names, and I'm reading the articles in the UK Guardian, which really seems to be the only paper that regularly kind of covers this in a competent way. And it starts to look like, to me, like there's a war going on over animals that's been roiling for years. And I don't know if these guys are the paid mercenaries, the rangers that are getting picked off 5 or 6 a year, or if they're the, they're the Alamo, though. Whatever the motivations are, that it seems like there's a war. And then, as part of this, I think I told you in the email that I was thinking that I could do this as a series of different stories, right? So if there was one that was really compelling, maybe that would dominate a whole book length narrative. But another approach might be for me to be, so I interviewed, I was able to reach actually someone who is a wonderful person, who is very senior at Greenpeace, just a few days ago. Also, everything's kind of come together. And when I let him talk, which I'm doing a lot of talking now, but I wanted you to understand where I'm coming from. But when I let him talk, without me saying it, I was surprised the degree to which Greenpeace, and he's been involved with them since the early 90s, right? That Greenpeace saw themselves as warriors in a war, like the way he was using language of this being a fight. And their ship was called the Rainbow Warrior, and it got blown up, their original one. And that from the beginning, he told me their origin story. And it was clear, like from the beginning, that was how a lot of those people looked at it, which I don't think is how would be every dimension of this, right? I don't mean to say that I would boil it all simply down into, I'm doing kind of a war story, but that's one dimension of it. Just like we're saying, you showed me the quotes, there's this other dimension of people who are like, why are these animals so important when we're starving, or where you treat these animals better than you treat Black people, or these other dimensions, but that would be one advantage of doing different chapters and different stories of it, is there's many different lenses to look.
I have to tell you about the war narratives. I mean, you're obviously acquainted with the war on drugs, or war on crime, and all these sort of different framings around wars on specific social and crime issues. With regards to war on wildlife, or war on poaching, it's very, very contested, and has been instrumentalized by anti-poaching units, and by a whole machinery that has sort of kicked into wildlife protection, and fighting this war. Literally, there are old apartheid generals involved in the poaching wars. And we've been trying to sort of kick back a bit against the terminology, because, essentially fighting wars against your own people, and you actually need to bring the people on board rather than fighting wars against them. And, So if, the research that we've been doing has sort of a bit of a normative agenda where we say, if you want to protect wildlife, you need to bring in local communities, indigenous peoples, because those are the people that are living with wildlife, and they often have lost land to wildlife. It's very similar to the US, where, Native Americans lost land and were kicked off out of these amazing places, conservation areas. So it's a very contested issue in Southern Africa. And yes, lots of people are talking about these wars, but these wars also come with collateral damage, which is quite hectic. Human rights abuses. I mean, you would have seen the reports about WWF supporting rangers that commit atrocious human rights violations, including murder and rape in the DRC and Cameroon and India and other places. So it's sort of, that war sort of narrative has sort of a bit of a flip side. Of course, it's sort of, once something becomes a security issue and it's elevated to war status, there's more funding, but the funding only goes into enforcement, law enforcement, and basically militarizing responses. And what you kind of need is a more sort of structural response. You need to look at, why are people going out there and poaching rhinos, poaching elephants? And it's unfortunately the focus is often on charismatic megafauna. So that's sort of your big species that you identify from Madagascar or all these Disney movies.
Yeah.
But a lot more threatened species. I mean, I'm looking into succulent trafficking at the moment, which is there's several subspecies that are, since COVID-19, on the brink of extinction, which wasn't the case beforehand. So it's interesting. And, we sort of talking more and more about whole of society responses, bringing communities in, making sure that they have a say in matters, that they have a say in the kind of socioeconomic development that they want for themselves, and, getting local people involved in protection, wildlife protection. And you have your Antons, that work for super wealthy private game reserves. They usually get paid a pittance. I mean, the money paid to rangers is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, they're putting their life on the line. And yes, so in terms of, if you use that sort of war framing, there's certainly, a lot of the poachers are equipped with hunting rifles and very, very dangerous weapons. So, of course, you cannot be naive. Rangers have to have guns themselves, just for self-defense purposes and all these sort of things. But it's quite crazy. And what I tried to show you with the quotations earlier is just sort of this complete disconnect. On the one hand, you have this really high value animal, rhinos, that has like really the better protection than what I have in Cape Town, one of the most crime-ridden cities in the world. And local people around the parks that, they have no services, no water, no hospitals, no road structures and stuff. So it's a really, really difficult issue in South Africa, especially South Africa, the most unequal society in the world, where, it's often sort of divided along racial lines. So white people protecting endangered wildlife for wealthy tourists to come and look at it or shoot it. And then on the other hand, people living on the periphery of game reserves and national parks that can hardly afford to put bread on their tables, bread and butter. So it's a really, really difficult sort of subject, So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, like, I think your story will probably unfold when you get here, and it's a lot more complex than any background reading would let you think. I mean, I constantly, I'm constantly aware of my positionality. I'm a white Namibian South African that knows a lot of the context, and I speak some of the languages, but obviously there's also that inside outsider phenomenon that you will have to deal with, but also, you know, issues of privilege and, you know, how much can you really understand of some, you know, the grassroots conditions, and is it, you know, am I engaging in sort of white savior behavior or poverty porn? I mean, all that sort of stuff comes up, you know, and it's really interesting having to, you know, straddle these waters. And, you know, you having talked about Ku Klux Klan, I mean, you will find a lot of like-minded people in South Africa. Lots of white South Africans, especially the ones involved in conservation matters, are extremely conservative, and you know, a lot of my interview data, Black people will say to me, oh, wow, you know, you guys, you white people, you really like appreciate wild animals' lives more than our own. And that comes up all the time. And there's now a growing body of literature about this. So it's I think, you know, you will find some very interesting data and stories on the ground. And it's not necessarily what you thought it would be. It's a bit of a minefield, but it's interesting, and it's stories that need to be told, because I think they're not just, you know, we're not, what would you call it? We're not extraordinary, we're not exceptional. I mean, the South African exceptionalism always gets sort of put out, oh, we're so special, we're the last country in Africa to get independent, all that sort of stuff. But actually, a lot of the stuff that happens here, it also happens elsewhere in the world. You know, it's interesting dynamics.
I wonder if we could do, because at the end of the day, I gotta, I think by now I only need 10 pages, but I need 10 competitive pages by basically by Monday afternoon, Monday evening, that I need to write out. And so I wonder if we could do kind of lightning rounds here, because I've given you a lot of the context. I think you understand now where I'm coming from, like what I know, and also the huge void of what I don't know, but, you know, kind of what I'm walking into this with. And so maybe if I put this out there, I mean, talking to you, I'm getting some ideas about it. Like for example, I feel like what we're saying is that every idea, everything we posit here on this subject is also, it's an idea, but it's also a foil. Like it crumples and it turns out you can turn it upside down. Like, oh, it's a war to defend the last animals on Earth, which sounds like a very bold, legendary story made for Hollywood or whatever. But then, as you point out, there's all kinds of problems with looking at it that way. And, or the conservationist, you know, you just painted a pretty dark portrait of a lot of the conservationists involved in this. And so like one thing I could do narrative, I mean, this all works really well narratively, right? Because like one thing I can do is I can tell a story in bold colors at the beginning that seems like everything you would want a dramatic story like this to be. And then the subsequent chapters kind of begin to dismantle and deconstruct parts of that and show how complex and how problematic it is. And I can do that kind of thing as a reporter and as a narrator. My question is, if I write this as a proposal for, say I do this with UCT or University of Limpopo Criminology Department, and maybe UCT would be better, right? But I'm going to get to you in a moment with, they want a plan from me of some kind, even though we're saying I can't anticipate it. But before we get to that, like from a criminologist perspective, if I'm proposing a research program and partnership with UCT, from a criminologist perspective, is there something my work could benefit you and your colleagues? And if so, what would that involve?
Look, generally speaking, it depends on the kind of collaboration that is envisaged. I don't know what your Fulbright grant would hold. As you know, I'm for example not faculty. I'm what is called a soft funded researcher. So I raise my own funding through research projects, and that's how I'm situated at UCT. I work with others in my research unit. So you know, usually what we try to see if there's if there are commonalities and stuff. I mean, if for example, if there's sort of a huge you know, if I need to put a lot of time into something, I would usually say, well, I need some kind of salary support. But I don't think that's necessarily the case with you. I mean, it could just be a research associateship where we are able to say, you know, Julien will come and maybe deliver 1 or 2 talks or a webinar or something. I mean, that would be easy. I mean, just as long as we, you know, it would be, I mean, you could look at doing something together, you know, that usually is like the best way of saying, well, you know, we co-host a webinar, a seminar, or we write something together, something like that. That's an easy way of showing like some form of collaboration in terms of UCT. Of course, if we were to do something bigger, then, you know, there would be, our research office would be involved. But, you know, if it's just a sort of academic collaboration, then I think there's no problem. And especially if you then also, there's, you know, you have, I mean, there's the interdisciplinarity, which is a big thing at UCT. So if you have the connection to film and media study, then it's already, you have it, basically you will be collaborating with the law faculty as well as the humanities faculty, which is a big plus. So that is sort of like, in terms of UCT, that shows interdisciplinarity. And if we can show some benefit, you know, that you would be doing a seminar or 2 or something, that would work from, certainly from GRG, so Global Risk Governance Program, where I'm situated. That would work. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking, as you talk about it, being someone, you have a lot of like hard skills, you know, like analytical skills that you've developed as a criminologist that enabled you to write your thesis and, you know, your peer-reviewed work on this, that requires a, you know, a really serious level of rigor that I wouldn't be bringing to the table, but you do. On the other hand, what I do is I find the stories, I find the narrative, and I find the common voice for it. And so maybe that's the nut of a partnership between someone like you and someone like me, you know.
Yeah.
That if we were to collaborate on writing something or on presenting something, and so what I'd offer maybe to the criminology department is a way to tell this in a narrative way. Is this something help and to mass communicate it? In other words, to communicate to the public about these issues, to translate it into a language that the public can understand.
Yeah, I mean, I'm dealing with a lot of, I've got 2 US grants at the moment that are starting off, and something that keeps on cropping up in discussions with the funders, the sort of research to action goals. So essentially, whatever you come up, your narrative text or, you know, the hardcore research that I do needs to be translated into something useful to stakeholders, and stakeholders can be the general audience. So it would be somebody reading newspapers or social media or wherever you publish your work. But it is also people that kind of hold, you know, well, hold power, have power in decision making, policy making, that sort of stuff. So I assume that probably would also be quite a strong issue. Well, I don't know how Fulbrights work. I've never dealt with Fulbright grant applications myself. I think it is only reserved for Americans, right? But I'm sure you have to show some sort of dissemination and impact.
Because they're part of the State Department, what they want to hear from us in the proposal, and what they say, we're unique in that we're not looking for outcomes and impact. What we're looking for is the relationship and the bonds that you build in doing the work together. because it's it's from the State Department. So their quote was, "Our mission is to foster mutual understanding between nations, advance knowledge across community, and improve the lives around the world." So what they want to know is like not what I'm going to produce with you all, but how we're going to create or foster a dialogue together and work together. Now, to me, that implies that we need a plan, in some way that it's like where you guys can see real direct benefit, so that it's not just a talk fest, right? But ultimately, that's what they're interested in. They're interested in American scholars creating connections and building relationships around the world. And so I guess maybe is like when you wrote your thesis, who was your audience? Like when you were writing it, what were you keeping in mind as an audience?
At that time, it was primarily, it was at a very high-powered elite institution in Germany, a Max Planck Institute. So at the time, it was actually to meet, the criteria to even, I did well in the end. But I have to tell you, my PhD thesis was like the most cited and most downloaded thesis at that Max Planck Institute ever. So it's like, it's it's quite extraordinary. But I spent 14 months of doing field work around Southern Africa and Vietnam and Hong Kong. And it is a bit dated now. I mean, the field work happened in 2013 and 2014. But there are lots of insights that would be very interesting for your sort of preparation. But I mean, I can also send you other articles that would be interesting just to look at.
One thing is I need to do an annotated bibliography by Monday as well as the other stuff. So some of this, is easier for me to do than other parts. The parts of the annotated bibliography that would be easy is everything, the broader literature that we were talking about before, where, a lot of this I haven't read, but they're sort of, they're milestones for me, or they're things that help me navigate the kind of thing I'm trying to produce. But the real meat and potatoes is literature I'm not as up to speed. So, I mean, I don't know if you could recommend some core literature, given what we're talking about, that, that I need to read, but also I would need to include in a bibliography to show that I kind of have a sense of, how to ground myself in this.
I'm happy to send you an end. Do you use EndNote?
Yeah, well, I can use EndNote. I use Zotero, but either way.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to send you a few. I'll just dissect them and send them to you. Yeah, there's a wide body of literature that would be of importance. I think I would, seeing that you're a historian, I definitely would look into conservation history. Somebody who's very famous is Jane Carruthers. She's a South African historian who's done the most amazing work. She's written a social history of the Kruger National Park. She's looked into sort of the history of game science or wildlife park science in South Africa, and kind of compared it to global developments. Quite interestingly, not surprising, South African model is very much based on the American park model. So it's interesting stuff. Jane Carruthers. I'll send you the details, and then obviously there's a lot of literature in terms of poaching, hunting, militarization, securitization. I'll send you a few names there as well that you. I've actually put into the chat. I put a paper on Virunga Park. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, so there's actually very interesting literature on Virunga Park and DRC and kind of stuff that's going on there.
Now, is that too dangerous for me to consider going there to do any, reporting or field work? Because people say the Congo, you'll get killed the minute you step in there. And
Not necessarily. I'm just trying to think. Maybe that article actually says it's run by private. I think it's like some private foundation that is protecting it. I mean, Esther Moraine, and she's a friend. I mean, she's a Belgian woman, young, and she has done the most incredible research in Virunga. So, you know, I'm sure she was fine, so you would be fine as well. I mean, obviously there would be certain security protocols and other things. I'm trying to think who's funding them again. I think it's some Belgian foundation and European money that is sort of propping up Virunga National Park. Yeah. Anyways, I mean, it might be very interesting to look at.
Yeah.
I
mean, to me, that seemed like a great story. I just, you know, you get an instinct for this, and I was just like, but oftentimes the best stories are also the you know, the most dangerous kind of, I mean, not, you know, it just works out.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
But, you know, you said something interesting, which is when I asked you about your audience for the thesis, the first thing you sort of suggested was that you were writing for a very elite and, you know, for experts, it sounded like. But then the second thing
Well,
was,
I mean, it was a PhD, you know, PhDs, I mean, my other work is for different audiences, but, you know, PhD, you have to really, you know, you have to meet the academic standard set. So
especially in Germany.
I was, sorry?
Especially in Germany, you know, you all in Germany have different rules for your doctoral theses. Like I remember, I mean,
no, it's completely nuts. But you know, I'm not German. I'm Namibian South African. I just happened to study there, and I had a German dad. But you know, I'm not German. But yeah, the academic requirements are crazy. You know, so. But never mind that. You know, I still had white conservationist old men writing emails to my supervisor saying that my thesis was completely biased and I should have never been passed because they didn't like what I wrote about. But you know, having said that, yes, it was it was targeted at a elite academic audience. But what ended up happening is that it was actually picked up by activists, by people working in rhino conservation, which was amazing. I mean, it went completely viral, and that was just, you know, the thesis was done, the fieldwork was done at a time at the height, if you want to talk about a war, at the height of the poaching war or the rhino poaching crisis. And, you know, there were some big insights in there. And I mean, I've been working on this ever since, and, you know, I've been disseminating my work and been talking to people, and yeah, sadly, you know, nothing much has changed. I mean, we're militarizing responses to poaching instead of looking at some of the drivers, but you know, I suppose it's a long game.
To say the quiet part out loud, what I'm getting at is how I might be able to help you, and to say the quiet part out loud, I'm getting the impression you don't need somebody who's good at narrative and mass communicating. You're pretty good at it yourself. Is that the case?
I just don't have a lot of time to do it. So you know, I've had I've got a long career. I've also been a news writer at some stage and stuff. So I do know a little bit about journalism and stuff. Yeah. And interestingly enough, I mean, you would not be, unless you read German, you would not be able to read it. But we actually, through Max Planck, there was a German German journalist that sat down with two of my colleagues and myself and wrote a book based on our research on illegal markets. And it was quite popular. It came out shortly after the PhD. I do think there's a lot of appetite for that sort of stuff. And unfortunately, as an academic, you don't really find the time to do the sort of more thick narratives, you know, descriptive writing that really sort of captures public imagination and often also moves mountains. You know, this is actually what research has shown. I think, you know, some of the most powerful academic work are often these anthropological narratives, ethnographic research that maybe has footnotes of academic sort of quotations, but it's actually a story that is being told. And I suppose that's pretty much what you are going to do as well, right?
Well, is that,
So-
you know, I guess when I'm circling around, I'm trying to figure out like how really, given who you really are and what you bring to the table, how I could benefit you or your colleagues.
Right.
And so, you know, because I kind of jumped in assuming like, oh, well, I'm the mass communicator, I'm the narrative person, but now I don't want to make assumptions. You know, a lot of what we've been doing on Zoom this whole time is kind of throwing out an assumption and then knocking it down, right? Which is what we do as academics. But like you know, so I don't want to say, oh, well, Annette does this, you know, very rigorous scholarship on the issue, but what I could do is I could tell the story and I could get it to the public. I don't want to say that if that's facile and not really true. You know, if there's a deeper way that I could benefit like you, your colleagues, or I could come there and a project like this could be a benefit, then I'd rather figure out what that is than kind of give something that would be more boilerplate.
But you know, Julian, I don't think you're wrong though. I think it's like that idea of mass communicating or making something more approachable to the general public is something that would be very useful. I mean, you know, what I could imagine is actually sort of like you telling a story and then using some of the data that we've collected or insights. You know, we've got theoretical, conceptual, all sorts of insights. That could feed into, you know, some of the background to the story being told. So your story is a story, like it might be a life history of somebody who's, you know, who's fighting or defending wildlife, or, you know, whatever their story is. And then the sort of the subtext could be, here's this research that actually talks about, you know, the importance of local communities and defending wildlife, and this is why so that this is quite possibly could be a very good linkage
Well, which
between the
is
work
exactly
that
what a good environmental reporter is supposed to do, is take the science and translate it to the public.
Absolutely. So some form of science communication that is that really is of interest to the general public, you know, and of course, like
you feel like you can do that, but you're busy doing the deeper, the more rigorous science and the criminology.
Yeah.
And there's only one of you, right?
Yeah. So I mean, that could very well be a beneficial relationship to both of us, because then you get sort of like pieces of our minds, our ideas, and at the same time, you know, we get sort of a bit of a global platform possibly for some of the research, which is great.
So to turn it around, I'm already getting a sense, I think, of what story you think needs to be told about all this, but I don't know. I could try.
You might find other stories. You might find lots of other stories, but you know, I think there are lots of interesting things. I mean, you know, if I were you, I would, for example, find somebody that works on plant extinction and poaching, because nobody is reporting about that. I mean, there are a couple of stories I think about Californian cacti and succulents in America, but
Well,
and here in South Africa, there have been 1 or 2 reports. I think there was even a National Geographic report recently on succulent trafficking. So, but, you know, like we're focusing on the big guys always.
Yeah, well, okay. So we've knocked down a few of these foils, like the idea that it's a war, it's that the Congo is the Alamo, you know, that you kind of debunked that or showed the problem with that. So what about this idea that, well, what's wrong with me telling the story of rhinos, elephants, giraffes, and all the things that capture the public imagination in order to let them, because they're the best ambassadors for all wildlife, what's wrong with them being the ambassadors in the story? What's the, you know, how would you
I think that's a very good point. I mean, I do the same. I say, like, in a lot of the presentations that I do, I talk about rhinos, and then my byline is the rhino stands for any other wildlife. So, for example, I often use the strap line, you know, we need to render a live rhino more valuable than a dead one to local communities. And then I explain, but, you know, rhino stands for any other wildlife. And, you know, so absolutely, I do think there is something about using Dumbo, Jumbo, and, you know, Madagascar and other, you know, all these big species, charismatic species. I mean, that really sort of gets the public going, you know. So
I guess I was trying to encapsulate, you know, what all this boils down in a nutshell. Like if I was to tell the story that would be a story that would be helpful to you and your community of scholars, like, because I'm thinking of this as a research partnership primarily. I mean, maybe I frame it like, I don't know. What do you think? Like, I could be more located by the parks, but be connected with you guys at UCT, you and Martha, and that would work? Do you think that
yeah,
would be an arrangement
I'm
that
sure that would work. Yeah. I mean,
okay.
we've got research associations with people across the planet. So, you know, if we can show that there's sort of like a good fit in the work that we do, that's absolutely fine. I don't know how it works in the film and media department. That might be different, but, you know, in terms of the GRG, so the research, my research program, that, you know, it would suffice to say that, you know, we share similar research interests, and we plan to collaborate on some level or other. And, you know, I mean, I'd be happy to motivate that. So we could give you an institutional letter of support that, you know, I'm working with a senior scholar called Clifford Shearing. I'm sure he would be happy to sign. I just have to show that there's some mutual benefit, that it won't take me away too much from my desk, too many distractions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think
But
it's more.
if it's beneficial, then, you know, it's then there's always, like,
Yeah.
you know, maybe often have requests where you know, people want to be associated with UCT because it's, you know, the #1 university in Africa. It's, you know, the top scholars situated there, and it looks good on people's applications. But that's not the issue with you. You know, like, I can see
Might
that
be
there's
for Fulbright.
benefits. Yeah.
You know, but what I think what Fulbright's trying to do is they're trying to have me show evidence that there's genuine interest, that I could be of genuine interest to UCT or to South Africa or to people in South Africa, you know, scholars and maybe the public. And then if I can demonstrate that, then they fund it. They're not looking, Fulbright's not looking for you guys to do any work. They're looking for me to do the work, but they're looking for, from what you guys, they're looking to find out that there would be a genuine benefit to UCT. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
So, you know, but I guess, let's see, yeah, I guess I was gonna say, like, maybe in a nutshell, the story that would be important to tell is all of the challenges with getting to understand this defense of animals, and the people who are putting their lives on the line. Because you think, like, on first blush, it seems like, oh, that's such a heroic thing. But then when we start to unpack it, it's so much more complicated than that. And in some ways that makes it more resonant and all the more important, because it's not just a simple story of, you know, a hero or whatever, or a martyr, and that all of those things that complicate what it's really about, what wildlife defenders are really about. So I guess I'm writing a book about wildlife defenders. But
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
to really
yeah.
understand what a wildlife defender is, to deconstruct that, that is, you start to get at a deeper understanding of the environmental crisis that we face. And I think
Yeah.
that's the project that would get at your research to some degree.
Yeah.
If I could translate that into a, find a public voice for that. Does that sum it up in a way?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, yeah. That's like that. I think that's a good proposal.
So then
And
the
I
next,
think,
sorry, go
yeah,
ahead. Well, the two other things, just to highlight it, and I know you've been very generous with your time, but I kind of, because they're asking this stuff and I need to give them answers. One is what challenges are you going to face and how are you going to deal with them? Like what's going to be most difficult about this, and how are you planning to address that? Which is, I think, a good question.
that's the insider outsider kind of a story that you touched on earlier. That you will have to find local sort of gatekeepers. You will have to deal with your positionality, coming from the outside in, the huge disparities between rich and poor, white and black in South Africa. And by virtue of you coming from the US, you will be put into the same sort of like class of people like I do. So like a privileged white person in South Africa. So that's sort of, it's sort of general research sort of issues. You will have to get a research permission to operate within the Kruger National Park and surroundings, if you want access to rangers, conservation officials. Yeah, so just some of the challenges are your normal straightforward research challenges that you will find everywhere. So it's like also, your fact-checking information, confidentiality, anonymity of respondents, and access, and possibly research fatigue, because tons and tons of journalists and researchers have been through the landscape, and there's like a high level of distrust because people have made huge promises and never kept any. So it's sort of those, you will come across in most sort of a research context in the global south. So that's something, you can put in there. So it's, the standard kind of, you will have to deal with accessibility. Just trying to think, when would you come? You said your summer 2023.
So I was
our
thinking,
winter.
yeah, I would be there from probably July. I could come maybe as early as June, but I would think July through December, January. Of course, I'm concerned about leaving these guys. I'll leave them with somebody close. I'm still lining that part up because I don't have a wife.
Yeah.
Thing, but I basically need a wife by next year for my cats. So I mean, I do have sort of a housemate / girlfriend. We're figuring things out, and I suppose she's volunteered to live here and watch them. I have a beautiful house in Hawaii, so strong incentive.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Okay.
but it would be, the idea is I get a year. See, UH offers me I can take a year sabbatical, but they'll only give me half pay, hence the Fulbright. Fulbright will pay. So the idea is I spend the first 6 months of the year doing the research with you, and I think the Greenpeace part of it would make it really interesting too, if unless it's just becomes too massive a project. But I was thinking once I return in December, January, I could work with the Greenpeace people for a couple months and try and get the story of how this is playing out in the marine world, and then spend basically the second half of the year writing it. And I did quite well with, so my book was my dissertation too. It was like 500 pages.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah. So I got like a full page. My goal with this one is to get a commercial publisher because they're so difficult. and
Yeah.
obnoxious that it just seems like a fun goal as opposed to going to another university press. And I mean, I had
Yeah.
my book got a full page review in the New York Times, and I won like I was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. So I think
Amazing.
that I just bring that up to say that I think I could find an agent and maybe a major publisher for a book like this, which I kind of don't care about, except that I think it's good with this whole thing. It's about, you can probably relate to this because I think we're the same age of like setting goals and setting dreams for yourself and trying to fulfill them. So do I need a commercial publisher? No. Do I need a successful second book? No. I mean, I have tenure, but do I need to go to Africa and on my sabbatical and go into no, but why not? Then rather than writing just, more historic, I mean, I'll keep doing historical stuff, but I look at this as like, I think I said in my email, one final return to journalism for me. I'm pretty rusty
Nice.
at it,
Yeah.
but so research plan, this is something I talked about with Martha, and it sounded good when I formulated it with her, but here's where I think, Annette, like you could be really helpful, because I mean, obviously I can only be so specific with them, but the most concrete I could kind of get with just thinking about it, brainstorming about it with Martha, was the idea that I start in the South and would try to work north a bit, because there's Kenya, there's Tanzania, there's the Congo, and you understand in a way that we wouldn't what expanding geographically into those areas, like if there's a different story there, are there different issues? Does that make sense as a research plan? And if so, how do I make that a little bit more convincing or concrete than just to say, oh, I'm going to start in the South and go north,
So, my immediate gut reaction, Julien, is to say maybe restrict yourself to one geographic focus, because it's already so complex to just deal with like one set. I mean, I thought when you said at first I started in the South and then I moved to the North, I thought you were talking about the Kruger National Park, because even there,
right. So you think I
different
should
context, like quite literally.
That's my story, the Kruger National Park.
Yeah. I mean, because you talked about Anton Mazimba and, Brewer and others, I thought, okay, that's an interesting focal point. Of course, and then when we started our conversation, I was asking you, are you just going to look at wildlife defenders, or are you also going to look at mining? I mean, there's so many different environmental defenders, and South Africa is sort of, we've got quite a horrible history of people getting assassinated or persecuted for being an environmental defender. So, what I'm trying to say is it might assist to have a geographic focus. On the other hand, if you end up choosing to go somewhere else, I mean, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, Kenya are all very interesting sort of wildlife, countries with huge reserves of wildlife and issues. But, each place has sort of their own issues, specific context-bound issues. So, before you go there, you would have to do a lot of reading and preparation. And there are just so many different debates. It might be interesting for a book, of course, to say, well, I've been to South Africa, I've been to Botswana and Tanzania. I don't know how much funding you would get through Fulbright. It might be very interesting, but let me tell you, I mean, with me for the PhD, I did this multi-sited ethnography, and I was well funded because of the the Max Planck sort of German taxpayer blah 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 support. And I spent months on end. First, I mean, South Africa and Namibia was easy because that's home territory. I went into prisons. I went into Mozambique. Mozambique was really hardcore because there were security issues, and I spoke to live poachers and kingpins and that sort of stuff. But you know, I mean, you have to hit the ground running, so to speak, in all these different contexts. And for me,
What's
I mean, there was
realistic for the
obviously
time window that I have?
well, I think if you have 6 months set aside for field work, or you know, engaging with the subject matter, I don't think it's realistic. I think that's enough to do South Africa, maybe Mozambique. You know, like
What
two
if
countries that are.
what if the focus is, you know, because you were saying there's all these different things. I was thinking the focus, you know, one way to keep a this really strong thematically and in line with a lot of what we've talked about our goals is if I keep the focus on that nexus between animal and man. Because when you know, Global Witness showed me that map, the thing that you know enabled me to realize, you know, where I wanted to go and what I really wanted to do as I stared at the map was to realize I'm interested in the animals and the people and this intersection, you know, and that's just so thematically rich right there. The idea of
Yeah.
what's in our heart that's wild, and this whole relationship between human civilization and the wild, and what in us is feral, and how sometimes we find our humanity in these animals, and the what's feral in our society, and you know what's kind and giving, and you know sometimes you know obviously that's you know it's dangerous out there in the wild too, but you know it's dangerous in the city. So I if that was my focus, do you still think like Kruger would, and that amount of time would be about as big as I want to go?
Yeah, I think, look, it depends. I mean, it depends on how much time you take for preparation and whether you have sort of places, networks that you can fall back on. You know, you obviously would have to do your connections before you go into the field. I mean, just in terms of my own experience, I mean, is it your first time on the African continent?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, for me, like because I've you know, when I did my PhD later in life, so I was 35 when I started doing my PhD. And I had, you know, a previous career of being a policy researcher, and I'd done a lot of field work and research across Southern and Eastern Africa. So, you know, I had already sort of very good networks that I could fall back on, and I had a professional reputation, which you obviously have as well. You know, you can, and the Fulbright behind your name would also work in your favor. But just in terms of like this being quite new terrain,
Yes,
I
totally.
think it might be easier just to kind of, you know, have a focus. I mean, you know, you could, of course, say you could focus on a transfrontier conservation area. So, for example, Kruger National Park forms part of the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area, which is Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. So maybe that might be easier to have sort of like a, you know, you're going to focus on wildlife defenders within Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. And then you know, it's that's perhaps one idea of, you know, you have a quite local focus because it's a specific sort of landscape. I mean, they talk about the Greater Kruger or the Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. There's similar role stakeholders, role players that you could rely on. So, for example, you could try, for example, get a research permission from the GLTP, Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park, instead of just having the Kruger, and then, you know, connect that way. I mean, that might be a way of, you know, having sort of like 3 countries in one go, but still quite a local focus. But you know, if you go, okay, I'm going to do South Africa and something completely different, Chad, Kenya, it just might be too much for 6 months. If you had 12 months, it would be easier.
What would be, you know, and obviously this is like a 3 to 5 page proposal for getting in the door with this. to simplify it to people at Fulbright who I guess presumably don't know Kruger National Park, how do I articulate why this is the story? This is the place to focus on. Like, what would be
You
the
could
argument?
say that is the epicenter of rhino poaching, the rhino poaching crisis in Southern Africa over the past 10 years. And, you know, it's sort of like a lot of the poachers initially came over from the Mozambican side into South Africa. Now it's sort of a mix of both. But you could basically say, you know, it's one of the biggest transfrontier conservation areas in the world. The big five are protected there. There are lots of issues, historical issues of dispossession, eviction of local communities, ongoing evictions from the Limpopo National Park, where people are being moved out of the park right now to make a space for wild animals. So it's an interesting sort of complex system, if you want to call it that. Where you have lots of different considerations. And also, of course, there's also issues of power. South Africa being sort of, if you want to call it a regional superpower versus Zimbabwe and Mozambique that are politically not as powerful. So they're often bullied into specific decisions around national parks or the Transfrontier Conservation Area. I mean, there are lots of things that would speak to, you know, Kruger or the GLTP, so the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park being focal points.
If I think about
Julien, I have to jump off in about 5 minutes. I'm already quite late
I'm sorry.
But yeah. Are there any specific issues that I can help you with now? I mean, the one thing that we most certainly can help with is some sort of institutional letter of support. All I would ask is that you maybe give us sort of a template or something, and then I could ask Clifford to sign that, and I'll put in a good word for you. So that's
Could we triangulate it maybe with Martha so that it's a teaching and research thing, and I'm connected?
For sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
and
yeah. That would be absolutely fine.
Is there something about Kruger I should read that would help? I mean, one of the things is I don't know anything about rhinos, but like, you know, are there elephants
So read my PhD. Read my PhD. It's like I'll you know what, I'm gonna send you a link to Jane Carruthers social history of the of Kruger National Park. Just let me quickly find it. I'll put it into the chat.
Okay, that's the history of Kruger.
Yeah, it's essential reading. It gives you an idea of what goes on there. Here we go. Kruger. Here we go. Do I have the?
And I mean, so if I wanted to do to explore other animals, it's rich with animals, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And with threats to the animals, I guess. Like, is there ivory poaching going on there as well? Is that a significant issue for Kruger?
Interesting enough, it is an issue, but not a big issue. And in fact, the elephant numbers have increased hugely in Kruger National Park. It's absolutely amazing.
So it might be a way to tell a good story about that.
Yeah, so it's a good story. I mean, the park authorities in confidence actually wish there was a bit more elephant poaching because they have an overpopulation of elephants right now. So the so-called carrying capacity for Kruger National Park is 7,000 elephants. They have 34,000. It's quite a lot.
Is there somewhere that is my best source for kind of to show threat, to show the, you know, from the wildlife, the animal populations that I need to go to for this stuff? Or do I just look in?
Come again. Come again. I didn't.
So are there definitive sources I need to refer to for things like elephant populations and rhino populations and the threat over the last few years, and, you know?
I would think that you can like rely on the African elephant and rhino specialist groups. So they're IUCN expert groups.
Okay, IUCN, what does that stand for?
International Union for the Conservation of Nature.
Okay, and so their statistics are really good for animal populations and threats and everything.
Yeah, they have the red list. Well, sorry, IUCN has the red list that you can also rely on. But, you know, there are also CITES, the Convention on the Trade and Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora. They also have a lot of reports coming out at the moment because the next COP, Conference of Parties, is happening in November in Panama. Is it in Panama? Yeah, it's in Panama, I think. So there's a lot of that kind of data you will find that should be quite accessible. I've put into the chat that the history of Kruger. So if you, it takes you straight to the PDF and you can download it. It's a brilliant one.
Yeah, thank you very much. So what I'll do is by Saturday or Sunday, I'm now thinking maybe I just don't worry about this. Maybe because I've met in person. Maybe the strongest sign should be you and Martha both went to the trouble of meeting directly with me on Zoom. You know, I've kind of met you, and so even though you're not right at Kruger, my best bet would be to say I'm going to partner with you guys, and you know, and I can explain the benefits for you. You're sort of my research partner, and she's more my teaching partner and my sort of, you know, fellow traveler in media. And so that makes sense as a partnership for us, because I think that's what they want to see, is they want to, you know, they're the State Department, so they want us just see strong relationships and a good project. I think that's my sense of, you know.
Cool, perfect.
You've been really kind.
It's been a pleasure to meet you, Julien. I'm so sorry that I have to cut the meeting short. It's just my day has started and I've got a whole bunch of meetings coming up.
Yeah, I understand. I don't want to burden you, but I will try to get you as soon as possible. You know, I'm praying to the gods of the muses, or to the muses, that I have a strong draft of a proposal by Monday night, because if I don't, I'm going to need to wait a year and try this with you guys a year from now. So it's you know, do or die, back to the old journalism.
Yeah, now never, now in a year's time. Perfect. So I wish you good luck with that. May the muse of writing and inspiration be kind on you this weekend, and lovely to meet you and your cats.
And should I send this to you on when I'm done on Monday with my draft? I mean, I've got to get it Thursday, but
yeah,
you know, maybe you'll be able to give me feedback. If not, you know, I understand it's hardly a lot of time. So
yeah,
but we do have till September 30th to get the letter of invitation right. So
perfect, brilliant. That's perfect. Okay, have a wonderful night. Good night.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a long day. Right.
I can imagine. Cool, June. Cheers. Bye.
Take care.